Imagine working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, in sweltering heat, with no breaks, no weekends, and no protection from your employer. Imagine children as young as 8 years old covered in coal dust, operating dangerous machinery in dark factories for pennies. This wasn't a horror story, it was reality in America just over a century ago. But out of that pain, out of that relentless struggle, a movement was born. One that gave us the 8-hour workday. One that brought weekends into existence. One that gave rise to an American holiday that millions celebrate but few truly understand. This is the untold story of Labor Day and why it matters now more than ever. Long before Labor Day meant barbecues, parades, and big sales, it meant something else entirely. It meant resistance. It meant the blood, sweat, and sacrifice of working men and women who refused to be treated like machines. To understand how Labor Day came to be, we need to go way back to the Industrial Revolution. In the late 1800s, America was booming. Railroads crisscrossed the country. Steel mills roared to life. Cities exploded with new factories, new immigrants, and new hope. But for the workers fueling that boom, the American dream was a nightmare. Factory jobs were grueling and often dangerous. There were no laws guaranteeing lunch breaks, safety regulations, or fair wages. Laborers worked from dawn until long after dusk, often in cramped, unsanitary, and unsafe conditions. Injuries were common, so were deaths. Employers had absolute control, and workers had little recourse. They could be fired at any time, for any reason. If they protested, they were often replaced by the next desperate person in line. But workers began to fight back. In the 1860s and 70s, the labor movement in the United States began to take shape. Small unions were formed first by skilled craftsmen, then by factory workers. They began to demand better pay, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. Some strikes succeeded. Many failed. But the spirit of resistance was growing. And that resistance reached a turning point in 1882. That year, two labor leaders in New York City, Peter J. McGuire and Matthew McGuire, had an idea. Inspired by labor parades in Canada, they proposed a day to honor the American worker. On the 5th of September, 1882, more than 10,000 workers marched through the streets of Manhattan in what would become the first unofficial Labor Day parade. They carried signs. They carried American flags. They chanted for justice. And after the march, they gathered in parks to eat, drink, and celebrate. It was more than a holiday, it was a statement. The idea caught on. In the years that followed, other cities and states began to recognize the first Monday in September as a holiday for workers. But it still wasn't a federal holiday. And the battle for labor rights was far from over. The 1890s were a period of intense labor unrest. Across the country, strikes and protests turned violent. In 1892, 300 Pinkerton agents clashed with steelworkers in Homestead, Pennsylvania, leaving several people dead. In 1893, the country plunged into a deep economic depression. Wages were slashed, unemployment soared, and tensions reached a boiling point. Then came the Pullman Strike, the event that would ultimately force the federal government to take action. Pullman, Illinois, was a company town built by the Pullman Palace Car Company, which made luxurious train cars. Workers lived in company-owned housing and bought from company-owned stores. In 1894, the company cut wages but didn't lower rents or prices. Workers, struggling to survive, walked off the job. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, supported the strike. Soon, railroad traffic ground to a halt across much of the country. President Grover Cleveland called in federal troops to break the strike. Violence erupted. Rioters clashed with soldiers. Train cars were burned. more than a dozen workers were killed. The public was outraged at the strikers, but many at the government and big business. Cleveland, under pressure, saw the writing on the wall. To calm the labor movement and to show support for the working class, he quickly pushed through legislation making Labor Day a national holiday, just days after the strike ended. It was signed into law on the 28th of June, 1894. But make no mistake, this wasn't a gift. It was a political move, meant to pacify a growing movement. And for many workers, the struggle continued. Even after Labor Day became a federal holiday, the labor movement had more battles to fight. The early 20th century brought new waves of strikes. Miners, steel workers, textile workers all demanded better treatment. One of the most powerful moments came in 1911, when a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. The doors were locked. Fire escapes collapsed. 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women, trapped in flames. The nation was horrified, and slowly, new labor laws began to emerge. The 1930s were a turning point. Amid the Great Depression, millions of Americans were out of work, but that economic devastation gave rise to some of the most important labor reforms in U.S. history. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal included laws that guaranteed workers the right to form unions and to bargain collectively. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 finally established a minimum wage, a 40-hour workweek, and outlawed child labor. For the first time, the American worker had real legal protections. Labor Day became more than just a symbolic holiday. It was a celebration of hard-won victories. Parades were held in cities across the country. Unions proudly marched with banners. Families gathered in parks. Politicians gave speeches honoring the contributions of workers. For decades, Labor Day stood as a reminder of the price paid for fair labor practices and the power of collective action. But over time, the meaning of Labor Day began to shift. By the 1950s and 60s, union membership was at its peak. Manufacturing jobs were plentiful, wages were rising, and many working-class families were entering the middle class. But beginning in the 1970s, things began to change. Factories started moving overseas. Automation began replacing jobs. Union membership began to decline. And with it, so did the visibility of Labor Day as a day of protest or pride. Today, for many Americans, Labor Day is just the unofficial end of summer, a day off, a time for barbecues, beach trips, and back-to-school sales. The parades are smaller, the labor speeches are fewer, and the hard-fought history behind the holiday is often forgotten. But the struggles that gave birth to Labor Day are far from over. In today's world, millions of workers still face long hours, low pay, and unsafe conditions. The gig economy has created a new class of laborers without benefits, job security, or legal protections. Warehouse workers, delivery drivers, fast food employees, many of them are facing challenges that mirror those of the 19th century. In recent years, there's been a resurgence of labor activism. Teachers striking for better pay and school funding. Amazon workers fighting for union rights. Starbucks baristas organizing for better conditions. Young people are rediscovering the power of collective action. And once again, Labor Day is starting to mean something more. Because Labor Day isn't just about the past. It's about the present and the future. It's about remembering that the rights we have now weren't handed to us. They were demanded, organized for, and won through sacrifice. And they can be lost if we forget where they came from. Every weekend you enjoy, every overtime check, every workplace safety rule was earned by workers who stood up and said enough. They risked their jobs. Some lost their lives. And they did it for a better world, not just for themselves, but for the generations to come. So, This Labor Day, when you flip a burger or head to a sale, take a moment to honor those who made it possible. The nameless factory workers, the immigrant garment makers, the coal miners, the railroad strikers, the women who marched, the men who stood firm, the voices that rose in unison and demanded justice. Their story is your story. Their struggle is your inheritance, and their legacy is your responsibility to protect. Labor Day isn't just a holiday. It's a warning. It's a reminder that rights can disappear just as quickly as they were won. That progress isn't permanent, that the fight for dignity and fairness never ends. So if this story moved you, if you learned something new today, don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. And make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and ring that bell so you never miss another chapter of the real history they don't always teach in school. Thank you for watching. This is more than history. This is the heart of America. And it's still beating.